Hyperinflation of the US dollar within 90 days. That is the forecast that is currently going viral and making its way around the internet. In a viral bet that Bitcoin would be worth 1 million US dollars within 90 days, Balaji Srinivasan is predicting an imminent hyperinflationary collapse of the US dollar by summer. So is this even a possibility? Could the dollar actually completely fail? And if it's a possibility, is it inevitable? Is this something that is certain to happen? And then finally, if it is a certainty, then is it imminent? Is it something that's going to happen right now within the next few months? First, let's take a look at the possibility. Is a hyperinflationary collapse of the US dollar something that is possible? Ever since the United States took the world off the gold standard in 1971, we have seen a very high frequency of hyperinflationary episodes where fiat currencies around the world have failed. This is because when a currency does not have anything restraining its creation other than political will, then usually the political will is to create more of it. And when that happens, the end result is a hyperinflationary collapse, and we've seen a lot of that happening over the last few decades. If you take a look at this chart from @BitcoinHomer, you can see a list of 152 currencies that have collapsed due to hyperinflation. The average lifespan of these is about 25 years, and the median lifespan is 7 years. But it's not just the small countries, the emerging markets, the dictators in control of small countries, it's even the big boys. And while some of these currencies listed have not yet fallen, we can see that most of the major currencies over the last 120 years have lost almost all or all of their value since inception. This infographic from Visual Capitalist shows some of the current major currencies and how much value they have lost versus gold over the last couple of decades. So we understand throughout history that hundreds of fiat currencies have hyperinflated away, have collapsed due to overprinting, and that it's not just the small countries, the corrupt countries. It's major countries that have either gone through that or are headed that direction right now. But it's not even just the major countries. We also see this pattern happening with the countries that control the global reserve currency. This visualization by Ray Dalio shows the rise and fall, relatively speaking, of great empires throughout the last 500 years. And breaking down the factors that lead to the rising and the falling of these empires, we see the black line that shows the reserve currency status is actually one of the last things to fail. And this brings us to the dollar. In 2020 dollars, if you go back to the inception of the dollar, which in this case is actually the Federal Reserve note, in 1913, it was worth $26.14. Over time, you can see that it has lost almost all of that value. The reason this happens is because of the nature of what currencies actually are. A currency always starts off as a redeemable instrument for a scarce asset. Normally throughout history, that has been gold. People put their gold in the banks, in the vaults, in the central bank, and they receive a piece of paper that says they can go get that money, that gold, back at any time. But eventually what happens is the central government, normally in conjunction with the central bank, is too hungry for more purchasing power. And instead of only issuing the same number of notes, currency units, redemption requests, claims on that gold as the gold that they actually have, they end up doing it just a little bit too much and printing a little bit too many because they think, hey, what's a little extra purchasing power gonna hurt? Well, eventually it hurts. There's a run on the bank, people go to get their gold, and it's not there. That's exactly what happened in 1971. Everybody went to turn in their dollars for gold, and it wasn't there, so they closed the gold window, and everybody was stuck with a bunch of worthless paper. And that's how the dollar as a fiat currency was born, but everybody was still using it, and so it didn't actually lose all its value because people could still use it to buy stuff from other people that were accepting it because they could use it to buy stuff from other people who were still accepting it. The only problem is now there is no more restraint, no more fear of a bank run on the issuer because it's not pegged to gold anymore. And so ever since 1971, the only thing stopping printing more dollars has been political will. And every time we get to that point, you can see the end result, the death of that currency, is when that political will fails and they overprint it. So it's pretty clear that a hyperinflationary collapse of any fiat currency, including the US dollar, is absolutely possible. But just because it's possible doesn't mean it's likely. So is a hyperinflationary collapse of the US dollar inevitable? Is it certain that it will happen? Well, let's take a look at the fiscal position that the United States finds itself in right now. The United States currently has $31 trillion in total outstanding debt. We also know that the Congressional Budget Office currently projects that the deficit will get worse every single year from here on into the future. We also know that interest rates on that federal debt are higher than they've been in years and are on the uptrend for the first time in decades. So let's put those puzzle pieces together. Number one, $31 trillion of debt at record low interest rates. Number two, the projections from the Congressional Budget Office of future incomes being lower and future expenses going way higher from things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and defense spending. Mandatory spending that will not go away, will not decrease, will only increase, which means more borrowing to make up the difference at higher rates. Meanwhile, all that old debt, you still can't pay that off with the money you're taking from taxes, so you have to borrow even more at the currently higher interest rates just to pay that old debt off. Which means that as you do this, the expense column goes up higher and higher, faster and faster, as just the interest portion starts to accelerate higher. Bottom line is, when you run the numbers, they can't afford it. First, I'd like to tell you about today's sponsor, I Trust Capital. Today, people are concerned about the purchasing power of their dollars being eroded due to inflation. They're concerned about the returns they're getting on their traditional portfolios, things like stocks and bonds. Many people want to be able to purchase investments that will preserve their purchasing power, things like gold, silver, Bitcoin, ways to store the value of your money without being exposed to the dollar. What's the problem with this? The problem is that most people have most of their wealth in their 401ks, their employer's retirement accounts. And these accounts do not allow people to buy gold, silver, or Bitcoin. Some of them allow access to ETFs that have exposure to these prices. But number one, you're introducing many layers of counterparty risk. And number two, you don't actually own the asset itself. That's where I Trust Capital comes in. I Trust Capital allows you to open up actual retirement accounts, IRAs, traditional and Roth. You can even roll over funds from a previous employer's retirement account to fund this. You can buy gold, you can buy silver, you can buy Bitcoin and even other cryptocurrencies with I Trust Capital. And if you sign up with my link in the description below, you'll get $100 worth of Bitcoin as a sign-up bonus for opening the account. The Congressional Budget Office themselves project that by 2053, the debt to GDP ratio will be 200%. What this means is that at some point, the United States will not be able to afford the interest portion of its debt, let alone all of its other mandatory expenses, because its debt load is growing and the interest rates on that debt load are skyrocketing. And so at some point, they won't be able to bring in enough from taxes and also borrow at those higher rates because there simply won't be somebody else left to lend to them. At this point is when the Federal Reserve steps in and they start to monetize the debt, as always happens throughout history. Every time the debt pile up gets too big in a country that controls a central bank, when that debt is issued in the currency that their central bank can print, the central bank always monetizes the debt. They print money to buy it. Once this happens and the Fed starts to grow its balance sheet by permanently purchasing all United States government debt and absorbs the national debt onto its balance sheet, we have flipped the switch and entered into inflationary financing, printing money to pay the bills. The debt, the interest no longer matter. The only thing that matters is the money supply goes up for every dollar the government spends. And yes, that is the point at which the hyperinflationary collapse of a currency always starts. Whether you want to look at Venezuela, Argentina, Zimbabwe, Lebanon, all of these recent examples, or you want to go back and look throughout history at the Weimar Republic in Germany or John Law's Mississippi bubble in France, it's the same story every time, which means that given the current financial situation of the United States, a hyperinflationary collapse of the dollar is almost inevitable. The only other alternative is getting out of this mess through deflation, a deflationary death spiral, Great Depression, paying off the debt or defaulting on it through austerity, and that is political suicide. And we just haven't seen a country choose that option when they print their own currency. So a hyperinflationary collapse of the dollar is inevitable. But is it imminent? Is this something that is likely to happen soon, let alone within the next 3 months? One of the main arguments for this happening soon is the recent cascade of bank failures, from Silicon Valley Bank to Signature Bank, even overseas with Credit Suisse. As these banks fail, what happens is more currency is printed, is created, whether through a temporary loan or a permanent purchase, in order to bail out the depositors at these banks. Because as you know, I've explained this in past videos, when you make a deposit in a bank account, it doesn't just stay there. The bank takes that dollar and loans it out somewhere else. And then whoever they loan it to receives it and spends that money on something, and so it goes into somebody else's bank account, and it gets loaned out again and again and again and again in a process called rehypothecation. This means that that $1 has moved between many bank accounts, and so it is not actually there. Normally this works out fine and you are able to access it and spend it as if it actually is there, because on net, usually all the transactions kind of net out against each other and bank inflows roughly will equal bank outflows. But in a case of a bank run where everybody goes immediately and tries to withdraw all their money, well, the bank doesn't have it. And so they have to sell their assets to produce those dollars. But right now, those assets are treasuries. And we know that interest rates on treasuries have skyrocketed. And when rates go up, bond prices go down. So banks right now don't have enough in assets to be able to sell to cover all withdrawals. This means that the total number of dollars that are in the system, if you start to have bank runs, would just shrivel up and shrink. So the Fed steps in and starts printing money again to give to the banks, at least temporarily, so that the banks can meet the deposit withdrawals. It's important to recognize here, though, that all of that money was already counted. It was already in people's bank accounts and it was already available for them to spend at any moment. And normally what happens is those inflows and outflows net out against each other and that money does get spent. Basically what I'm trying to say is that without the bailout, all the money shrinks and you have massive deflation. The money just disappears. With the bailout, the total amount of money stays the same. There's no more new money going into people's checking accounts. They just keep the money that was already there. This means that as of right now, the bank bailouts are not, in absolute terms, inflationary. They just lock in the inflation that has already happened. Further, this means that credit conditions are tightening like crazy right now because banks are in trouble and they know it. And so they are not out there increasing their risk. They are not out there making new loans. They're trying to prepare for the possibility that money might be walking out the door. And when credit conditions tighten, that means there is less money floating around in people's bank accounts, not more. Banks are making less loans, and as loans always are, some loans are getting repaid. And so this means the total amount of money that's actually in circulation, like people's checking and savings accounts, is going down on net. This gives us insight into what the marker will be for recognizing when we flip the switch from deflation back to inflation, because the catalyst will not be bank failures, the catalyst will not be bank bailouts, and the catalyst will not be nationalization or increased regulation of banks. The catalyst is actually going to be US debt monetization and a regrowth of the money supply. This is the Fed's balance sheet, and when it starts to go up, not from bailing out the banks, but from buying US government debt again in order to fund government expenses, that is a signal. And this chart is the money supply growth. So long as the growth of the money supply is in negative territory, we do not have the mechanism to tip over into hyperinflation. When this chart looks like it did again in 2020, or likely even worse, then it's time to start worrying about hyperinflation. So no, hyperinflationary collapse of the US dollar is almost certainly not imminent, not going to happen within the next 90 days. I could be wrong, but the signs just don't point that direction, in my opinion. This is good news. It means there's time to prepare because we know what the end is for all fiat currencies, and that is evaporating through hyperinflation. No currency has yet died of deflation. And if you know what the end result is, and you know we're not there yet, it gives you time to prepare. To buy gold, to buy silver, to buy Bitcoin, to buy the assets that will endure far longer than the currencies that will fail, to buy food, to buy access or ownership of the production of food and water, hard, real estate, assets that people will need to use no matter what is happening to the currency. We know how the story ends, we just don't know how many pages are left in the book. As always, really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.